So what you guys just watched is a time-lapse video I created over the last few days kicking off the new year. By the way, Happy New Year to all of you guys. If you are new to this channel, well, I just want to say welcome and thank you for watching the video. So one of my main goals for 2023 is to do more time-lapse photography when I'm out in the field. I've done a little bit of it in the past, but I really wanted to ramp it up this year and add it as a tool to my toolkit in my different various filmmaking adventures. So to kick off 2023 and my time-lapse journey, I decided I would go ahead and make a quick video about how to help you guys make better time lapses and some of the techniques that I'm going to incorporate and some things I haven't incorporated yet that I'm going to hopefully this year. So before we even jump into the computer and talk about some camera settings, I just want to talk about the basics of what makes a good time lapse. So really, time lapse is a marriage of photography and videography, even though videography is photography because it's just taking a bunch of little mini images and stitching it together, but I digress. So there are three things that really make up a good time lapse in my opinion. One is the light, two is the composition, and three is the motion. These three things together really make a good time lapse. So let's talk about light real quick. Now, we're not always fortunate enough to have amazing light, meaning you're not getting all these really cool dramatic shapes and textures and colors in the sky. But the thing about a time lapse is it is taking a long portion of time and condensing it down into a short viewable clip for your viewers. So it's going to show a long bit of time in a short amount of time. And that really makes it interesting. So the thing about light is understanding that you are capturing the change of light in that scene. Typically, when we take a photograph, we're capturing that moment of light, similar to the image you see here. The best time lapses show an awesome change from beginning to end. So this can be as simple as capturing a sunrise over your city, or maybe you are just showing passing of time as shadows get longer during the day. What really makes these intriguing for viewers is the fact that you are looking at something that you see every day, but you're seeing it in a time frame that you would never physically be able to see it. Then obviously when you do get amazing light, similar to the storms that I had the opportunity to photograph the past few days, the opportunity to create amazing dramatic style time lapses is then presented to you. But the thing about light is if you don't have amazing light, then you really need to focus on your composition and your movement. So let's talk about composition here. And I'm not going to dive into a whole long lesson on composition because frankly, I can't cram that all into one video. But this is where I'm going to post a shameless plug and say, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below and then drop a comment on some composition questions you might have. And then that way I can create some content for you to hopefully answer your questions in the future. But the main thing I want to talk to you guys about in your compositions is understanding that you need to highlight that change of time. So your composition should highlight and it should balance and it should complement the change of time that you are capturing. Let's take this one time lapse for example that I created here. I knew that the clouds were going to be moving from the bottom left to the top right of my frame, and I went ahead and got really low to the ground and used this cactus on the left side of the frame to frame up those clouds. It removed a lot of distracting elements in the left side of the frame that was there when I was up higher, and it kind of created almost this bumpers and bowling style feel with the clouds with the other elements of the foreground. So a quick tip for you guys when you get to a location and you are looking for a composition, first study the light. Now sometimes the light is going to be changing rapidly. Like for example, the time lapses I showed you guys earlier, that light was visibly changing every second. Those clouds were really moving. So it made it really easy for me to think about a way to compose it to highlight that. But sometimes you might have to sit there for maybe a few minutes and get an idea of what's going on, and then look for elements to support your subject. Again, the light is the subject. That is the change of time. And then the other tip I have for you guys on composing your image is go into your camera settings and change the aspect ratio to a 16:9 aspect ratio. This is the aspect ratio that videos usually come in. Our modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras shoot typically in a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now, it's okay to have these 3x2s, then maybe punch into a 16:9 later. But personally, I find that if I compose in a 16:9 aspect ratio, my compositions are a lot better in my time lapses. Now, every camera is different, so I'm not going to sit and really explain how you can change these, but just go into your menus and you should be able to find an area that says aspect ratio or crop overlay or anything like that, and you should be able to change it to a 16:9. Again, this isn't a must, it's just something that I personally have found to help benefit my workflow when out in the field. And the last piece that makes up a compelling time lapse is movement. Movement can show up in so many different ways in a time lapse. It can actually be physically moving your camera. Now, this is something that I have not personally done yet, but I want to do more in the future, is use sliders and other styles of equipment to help create a dynamic movement in my time lapses. Another area that adds movement is, of course, the movement of light, right? Now, we're always going back to light. That's why it was number one on my list. And the last piece of movement that you could see is actual movement of people, vehicles, objects, or anything else really out there. Sometimes the wind moves the trees, or maybe an airplane flies through your scene, but regardless of what type of movement really helps add to these time lapses, because all movement is exaggerated, which is really cool. It goes flying by really quick and can create some awesome looking images. I layered these 3 keys like this on purpose. First, you need to understand the light and understand what is going on. Then you're going to compose to that light, and then you're going to look at the motion. Now, your composition and your motion can really be interchangeable in that 3 and 2 spot, in my opinion, because motion can become a part of your composition and really should be a part of your composition. But if you start to understand and take ownership of these 3 areas, then it's going to really help you create a more dynamic time lapse. Now, another thing that I'm going to start doing this year is what is called a hyperlapse. Now, most drones have a hyperlapse feature built into them, which is awesome. I just started to use it, and I'm going to give you guys some tips when I get into the camera settings section and how to maximize those drone hyperlapses. Now, the cool thing about a hyperlapse is it adds a ton of motion because your camera is moving between every frame and getting either moving dramatically from side to side of your subject or towards your subject. So you're getting this really cool drastic movement over a large space with your camera while also having a drastic movement of time happening in that frame. The difference between a hyperlapse and maybe like a slider movement in a time lapse is a slider is going to be typically just around your composition. It's going to move maybe a 6-foot slider is the biggest one I've ever seen, so you're not going to get a ton of motion. A hyperlapse covers a ton of ground. Now that you guys understand those 3 tips on how to maximize a time lapse, let's talk about some settings that you need to look at or some gear you might have to get. To shoot a successful time lapse, you need to first off have good camera settings. Now, there are definitely more difficult scenarios where high dynamic range scenes can be created and can cause issues with exposing and creating a balanced image. So you need to take that into consideration when you're setting your settings. An example of this could be maybe you're shooting from nighttime to a sunrise. That change from dark to light can often create issues for you. Now, a tip that I would do and I've used is I would shoot in either a shutter speed priority or aperture priority so that you can lock in that specific setting and let the other settings change over time as the light in the scene changes. If you don't have a real drastic change and you believe that your camera is going to be able to capture all the exposure that you need in just a single setting frame, then you can stick to a manual setting. The other setting you're going to need to do is add your intervalometer timer. Now, most mirrorless cameras have intervalometer timers built into them, and that can be found again in your camera's settings menu. But if your camera for some reason doesn't have this, or you're shooting on an older DSLR camera that might not have this built in, then you're going to need to actually pick up an actual physical intervalometer that plugs into your camera, and you'll dial all your time-lapse settings through that piece of gear. Now, setting your intervalometer is also an art when you're doing these time lapses. So typically I try to stick between 1 and 3 seconds, and every now and then if things are really slow, then I can get away with like a 5-second intervalometer. You also need to consider your shutter speed. So if you have a really long drug out shutter, then you might need to keep those intervalometer times closer to each other so you don't create gaps. And by gaps, I mean you're gonna see like stuttering or jumping happening. It's not gonna be a nice smooth motion. But for example, the other day, I could physically see everything moving really quickly. So I went ahead and set my intervalometer to a 1 second interval. So every second it took an exposure. I had a fairly quick shutter speed going on because it was a brighter scene. And for the most part, I was able to capture a lot of frames in a short amount of time. Now, being able to capture a lot of frames in a short amount of time is awesome because then I'm able to create more time lapses with my time out in the field. I typically like to try to create a 200 frame or around 200 frames in my time lapses. So you can actually set your intervalometer to take that many exposures, or typically what I'll do is I will then just let it go constantly and I'll just monitor the back of my screen and see how many images I've taken. That way, if there's something interesting happening, I can let it go longer, or if I know that the time has happened, I can just shut it off. Now with around that amount of frames, you're going to get typically anywhere between 8 to 15 seconds in your time lapse, which I find to be a very workable file size for creating these time lapse videos. Now you might want to have longer ones, or you might want to have shorter ones. That is completely up to you, and you can have the creative freedom on that. I'm just kind of telling you guys the workflow I used when I was creating this video. So if you guys have any questions about all that content that we just covered up to this point, drop them down in the comment section. I'll try to answer all of them that I can, and then I'll also create a follow-up video for you guys in the future if I see like a reoccurring theme in the questions. I am going to say one last thing about your interval timer. Typically, if you're going to be using a slider, your slider will allow for you to have an interval in your change, meaning that every frame it's going to move a certain percentage or a certain distance. It's important to dial that in so again you get a nice smooth movement with your slider and you don't get any jittery. This is also the same case with your hyperlapse. You can set your hyperlapse to have a specific speed that it's going, and you can tell it to take a certain amount of frames over a certain distance. Again, this allows for you to not have any jittering or jumping in your frame and create a nice smooth motion when you piece it together in post. So let's go ahead and jump into the computer now, and I will show you guys my workflow. Okay, so now that we are in the computer, the first thing that we need to do is open up your raw converter. I like to use Lightroom. I use all the Adobe Suite products, but if you use other softwares out there, I'm certain the workflow would be very similar. Now, what I'm not going to do just for the sake of time on this video is walk you guys through editing and some of the other tips I do in the actual video side of my workflow. Now, what I will do though is I will post a follow-up video talking about some editing tips and some of those movements and tricks I use in my video editing software that I'm alluding to here. So make sure that if you guys have not already, click the subscribe button down below and the bell icon so you can be notified when I post that video. And if you have any questions or want to see any of the movements that I created in that initial time lapse, then go ahead and drop a comment down below so I know which ones to highlight. But again, I will make a follow-up video talking about editing and some transitions and music and all that. So one thing I do want to show you guys is I will scroll, because I did not do this in my first 2 time lapses the other day because I was rushing and I forgot to do it. But anytime you are done with a time lapse or about to start another time lapse, or if you made an adjustment or a movement or you screwed up a setting or something and you want to fix it, always take a frame of your hand. It just helps you when you're in post to know where things end and begin so you aren't going crazy looking at little tiny thumbnails. Also, if you're in a Lightroom user, if you hover over between the black bar and the gray bar there, you'll see these 2 arrows. You can click and drag and shrink your thumbnails, or you can increase your thumbnails. Also helps when you're looking through thousands and thousands and thousands of images. What we are going to do is come over here. Now, these first few frames, I think I was messing with settings and my focus point, so I think that's why I started my edit over here. But what I want to do is find the first frame. So in this instance, it is image number 19, and I'm going to scroll until I find the last image. Thankfully, I changed some settings and blew my image out like crazy, so it made it easy. But now that I know that the end of that sequence is image 401, what I want to do, knowing that that first image is selected, is now I'm going to hold Shift on my keyboard and I'm going to click that image. What that does is it selects every image in between those 2 points when you hold shift. It just helps you highlight all of those images at once. From there, what I will do is I will come up to File, I will hit Export, or you can just hit Control Shift and E if you want to do a keyboard shortcut, but for the sake of this video, we will just go to File, click Export. What you will do then is select your specific folder. For this example, I have it going to my time-lapse lesson -Red Rock. That's just what I named, whatever naming convention you use for your files. And then I usually will always put these in a subfolder. This was named from another time lapse, so I will just come up with a name so I know what time lapse this is. So let's call this Wide Cactus with Sun. Just something really simple and plain. But the reason I want it in that subfolder is it helps organize all the images, and when we go to import it into Premiere or whatever video software you're using, it'll make a lot more sense then on why it's important to put this in its own individual folder. And then I will click Export, and then I will wait for all of these files to export. Now that that's done, let's open up Premiere. Now that I have Premiere open, I'm gonna come up here to my project area. I'm gonna right click and hit Import. You can also go File, hit Import, or you can hit Control I, either, whatever floats your boat. But right click, Import. We're going to go find a time lapse here. I think I named that originally the first time lapse, so we'll just go to this. In this folder, you can see all of the different images that we just recreated and exported to this specific folder. Now, what I want to do is click that first image. If you look down here on the bottom section, you'll see Image Sequence. We want to make sure that that is checked. What this is telling Premiere is that file that we have selected, every file coming after that is a part of a sequence with that file. Meaning it is telling Premiere that, hey, I want to make a short video clip out of all of these images. If you don't have that selected, it's just gonna import the one image and it won't do what you think it will do. So make sure that's good. And then we'll hit Open. And now you'll see that it opened up just a single file. And if I kind of screw up through it, you can see a nice time lapse happening. So how do we get it on our timeline? What I'll do here is I will create a new sequence. Just simplicity's sake, we'll just create a 1080p 24 frames per second sequence. I always use 24 frames. Typically, you can use 30 frames a second, but I like to use 24 frames per second. That is kind of what I base my math off of in the field when I want to create a time lapse. So if I want a 10-second time lapse at 24 frames per second, I will say 24 frames times 10 seconds is 240 frames. So that's kind of what I know I need roughly in the field if I want a 10-second time lapse. So I just typically, my workflow is always using 24 frames per second. So I know a lot of people out there use 30 frames per second, and some other people out there use 25 frames per second, depending on what part of the world you're from. We're not sitting here arguing about frames per second. I'm just going to tell you that I use 24 frames per second, and you should probably consider what FPS you are editing in when you're creating these time lapses, so you know how many frames to shoot. Enough rambling. So now that I created that sequence, what I'm gonna do is click and drag this in. I'm going to keep my existing sequence, and I need to scale this down. As you can see up here in my program sequence monitor, it is very zoomed in, and that's because this is a large file. It's a lot bigger than 1080p. It's probably closer to 8K. So what I'm going to do is right click on my clip and go to scale to frame size. Now why I like to have it scale to frame size instead of right clicking and set to frame size is if I set it to frame size, if you look up here underneath my scale in my video control panel or effects control panel, you'll see it scaled it all the way down to 21. Whereas if I just set it to frame size or scale to frame size, it's going to scale it back down to 1080p, but it's going to keep my scale rating at 100. And this just helps me in my workflow on my math on how much I want to zoom in or zoom out or create fake motion. Again, I'm not going to dive too much into that here. You guys are getting a little freebie before the next lesson, but I personally just like it at 100, so I always do that. Now, if you notice that there's black bars on both sides, that is because I did not crop this to a 16:9 before I exported it. I left this as a 3x2. So this is what a 3x2 would look like in a 16:9 sequence. So what I need to do is come over here and I'm gonna scale it up. It probably needs to go up to like 110, maybe even more. Okay, let's go 125. Okay, and then we can double check it. Yep, so right about 120 is pretty good. And then you can always come in and kind of reposition, because we do have more room on the top and bottom of the frame. So that looks pretty good. Now what I'll do now for you guys is I will render this clip so we can watch it at full resolution. And there you go. We have our time lapse. Now from there, what I would do is I would go and find some good music. I would piece together some of my other time lapses, and then I would put a bunch of different effects. Like you guys saw, I had a bunch of different movement. I had like a vertigo effect in one section there. I had a bunch of speed ramping. All of that stuff, all that like teaching part is gonna be coming in the next lesson. So this is all I'm gonna show you guys today. And I'm also gonna show you guys more of my Lightroom processing, because I process my images in Lightroom, and then what I do is I finish them here in Premiere, just to give my videos a cohesive look. So if I'm piecing it together with some other footage, maybe of myself or some stock footage, I use some tools here in Premiere to help really balance everything out. So that's all I'm going to talk to you guys about today, but I hope that this video was helpful for you guys, or maybe inspired you guys to go out and create some more time lapse for yourself. It's always a useful thing to do in the field while you're out there shooting and scouting. I like to typically set my camera up and let it do a time lapse while I then go look for other foreground options. And maybe I missed something, or maybe there's something that's better than what I'm shooting. And at least now I'm not missing light, and then I'm getting, more output for my time out there in the field. If you guys are newer, please consider subscribing to the channel. It does help. While you're down there, go ahead and hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and then also that bell icon to be notified when I post another video. I got a lot of pretty fun content, all based around photography and videography, mostly nature theme and travel themed, but I got some other stuff coming down the pipeline too, so you guys won't want to miss out on that. But I will catch you guys in the next video.